The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Steve Day with StrataCom. With us today is Eric Krueger. He'll be the presenter. Hope everyone is staying safe and healthy. We will be recording this webinar, and it'll be emailed to the community. So Eric will be talking about REST API and lessons learned and best practices. And I'll let Eric take go. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks a lot, Steve. Good. Now, can you still see me? I closed the window. I can't see what you guys are seeing, so. Is my video still on the presentation, over the presentation somewhere?
Yep, I can see it.
Okay. All right. So I thought I'd do a little video of me, just since this is the most exciting slide I've got, because this information is pretty dry and technical. So this is our REST API deep dive version 2. So I've got a previous deep dive I've done it was pretty technical, really talked about like my favorite development tool for API development, PowerShell, and I talked a lot about how to build things, and really technical. This is going to be a little more high level, and it's going to answer lots of questions in the forums, lots of questions I've answered, like if one of my consultants pulls me into a conversation with a customer and they have questions on the API. So lots of like kind of architectural, how do I do this? How do I set this up? What's kind of the best practice? I'm running into this problem. How do I solve this? So lots of things like that. So of course, if you have questions, you can contact Steve or Laura. Their emails are here. And of course, if you signed up for this, you probably know Steve or Laura, so you can work with them. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about StrataCom. I'm sure most of you probably know who we are and what we do. Why? So we built the REST API application framework. So that's where I got a lot of this knowledge, is working with Cherwell's API every day, building this framework. So I'll kind of describe what the framework is, what it's for, what we use it for, and then I'll go into the bulk will be these API specifics. I've got a list of API things that kind of the most common questions, the most common issues that people ask about the API. All right, so StrataCom was founded in 1997. We've been a Cherwell partner now for 9+ years. We've got 16 Cherwell consultants. We do host this advanced practitioner call. So if you know other people that would be interested in this, other customers, just either, you can reach out to Laura with who they are and she can email them, or you can just send them Laura's email. She's kind of the one that organizes these. And we do have some complementary strategic products. You'll see these today just because I'm going to demo some of our framework and how that works. So the mobile client for Cherwell and our Kanban boards. And then we're working on an editable grid right now. That's an alpha. If we have time, I will show you what we've got so far. And that is going to turn into a time tracking widget for mobile or desktop, where people can enter time into Cherwell kind of like in a grid format very quickly. So then we've also got like Active Directory users, teams, work group integration pack, and we've got some maps. Probably the most popular, customer approval in red. Well, I'll show you a little bit of red today when I show you some of the Kanban stuff, and that's just to track requirements, enhancements, and defects. And if you do have questions, just put them in the chat. Steve will be kind of watching that for me, and he may interrupt me with questions. If Steve doesn't interrupt me, you might want, can you raise your hand in here? I don't even know. This is GoToWebinar. I'm not sure what you can do there, but you can use the chat for sure. Steve will be watching that for questions, and I will attempt to answer them. If you have something specific about something I've talked about, just chat it in, and Steve will let me know. Just a little demo of our Kanban and mobile products. I have this in all of our presentations, but on the left is our Kanban, and on the right is mobile. So might be interested to know that Cherwell actually implemented our Kanban boards. We actually created a custom object for them for their marketing department. They got about 50 people in marketing that were using Jira to manage marketing campaigns. So we created a marketing object in Cherwell and threw our Kanban board on the top of it, and they actually replaced Jira and a document management repository product they were using to manage documents. And they're also so now they're managing their documents in Cherwell via our Kanban board. So Cherwell Corporate is now officially a Kanban board user, which is pretty cool. They were able to use their own tool now to manage their marketing campaigns, where before they couldn't. So they're excited about that. and we're actually rolling it out to another department. In fact, I have a call with Bill, who's rolling it out right after this call to discuss some of their board requirements. So, okay, so what were our goals? This is where I got all this experience, is building these products. And I don't think there's probably anybody else who's done as much as the APIs we have, just because we kind of built this entire framework on Cherwell's API. So what were some of our goals? So we wanted products that were completely configurable. So we didn't want to have anything one-off. So we're really using Cherwell scaffolding, or their framework, in order to build environments that we can customize instead of code. So we had kind of a requirement around, like, if you have a mobile environment with us, or a Kanban board, that we have to be able to change those in minutes, like make changes immediately without pushing code or without doing anything like that. So so we built this framework that we can build kind of applications on, just like Cherwell did, right? Cherwell's core, or whatever you want to call their development environment, it's just a framework with metadata about database tables and things like that, and you know, kind of a GUI-based process designer that makes it really easy to code. So we kind of went the same route. So real-time updates, when users update a record mobile, our solutions must update instantly without interrupting the user. So we use WebSockets to do that, SignalR. So you don't really have to refresh, you get updates in the background. So not really an API thing, but just it's kind of one of the limitations of the API, since it's stateless. And Cherwell did not, even though they use WebSockets in their Blue client for updates, they do not use it in the API. So there's no way the API will not plug into their WebSocket background and update tickets in the background. So we had to build that functionality. So, oh, looks like I had duplicated the same thing. All right, so what were some of our challenges? Well, the REST API is missing some basic functionality, and I'll talk about this later, but there's no way to view Cherwell team members with the API. That's a big one. And there's no way to get this information without making substantial changes to Cherwell. You can't run OneSteps in REST API calls until 9.7. So I will talk about this later, but it's possible using SOAP. And if you're using SAML, there's some more challenges there. And there's just a lot of tables in Cherwell that aren't available for REST calls. So basically, all the trebuchet tables in the back end, you don't have access to unless you build a Cherwell metadata object, or what they call an object, which is just kind of a collection of metadata about that database table in Cherwell. Without that object, you can't access any of those tables via the API. Stored queries only return the columns in the default grid. There's lots of bugs with the REST API depending on the version. So of course, we're building applications across multiple versions. So we can't just build something that will work with 9.5.3 or 9.6 or 9.7 or 10. It has to work with basically any version that supports the REST API. So, and you run into lots and lots and lots of different issues with the REST API across versions. Some users just can't use the API, and you got to delete and re-add their account. Certain queries that pull back users' ticket cache things, and I wouldn't call the API developer friendly, although maybe that's not the right term. I would say it's not casual developer friendly. So if you're a casual developer and are used to working with basically hard-coded API calls, this is probably going to be a little bit of a challenge to learn, because they use building blocks basically to build API, which is brilliant for what we did, but for the normal casual developer, it's kind of there's a steep learning curve. All right, so here's what we're going to talk about today. I'm first going to talk about some of the core building blocks of the API, just kind of briefly go over those. And Cherwell's got great sample code in PowerShell and C#. And PowerShell, to me, is a language that anyone can learn. And so I love PowerShell. It's not, C# is so object-oriented, it's difficult for people to learn, but PowerShell, although it's object-oriented, built on .NET, the way you actually code with PowerShell, it's fairly simplistic compared to C#. Plus, PowerShell is ubiquitous, it's on every machine, so everybody already has PowerShell. You don't need to download VS Code and all that to use it. So and we'll talk a little bit about token management. I got a lot of questions from this from customers, especially customers with multi-threaded applications. I'm going to talk about using service accounts for things like a portal app. I'm going to talk about some of the authentication challenges, mostly with SAML. I'm going to talk about portal logins, running OneSteps, saving records versus creating records. I've just got a few tidbits about that and some things that I've helped customers with and even my consultants with in the past. The required specifics conundrum. So we'll talk about that and what some of the workarounds for that are and even what that issue is. Maybe you've run into it before. I'll talk about Cherwell saved queries via the API, Adhoc queries via the API, related records via the API, public ID versus rec ID and how it affects what you do with the API. This getting team membership that I talked about a little bit earlier, I've got a couple solutions for that. And then I'm going to kind of demo performance. I had it in here because I'm a big performance guy, but essentially performance with the API generally good and fast, and faster than what you'll see in Cherwell's Blue Client and browser client. There's lots and lots of things that they're doing that you don't have to do if you use the API, which makes it extremely fast. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about these API building blocks. And I'm going to do, so I'll talk about these building blocks and I'll kind of show you how we use them. So their Get Business Object Summary is the first building block. So if you're going to go out and say build a form where you want somebody to enter information and submit it and create a ticket, the first thing you're going to start with is this business object summary. So this will get you the business object rec ID. Now you could go into the Orange client and get the rec ID that way in advanced, but if you're just an API developer, you might not even have access to the Orange client. So this is how you get the rec ID. You pass in the business object name. Of course, there's a way to get the list of business objects too, but you might be better off just saying, what is the business object name of incident? Oh, it's incident. So you just pass an incident, it'll give you some information, including the rec ID. Then you use Get Business Object Template. That will get you all the fields in the business object, including those fields rec IDs, which you may want to use. So you will need that information to put together your save business object. So you maybe have a form. So to populate that form, you put fields on it, and then you would take the values out of those fields and call save business object. So you can use the values you get from the first two calls to populate this call to save and create records in Cherwell. There's a format they use with fields. Fields is just an array, so they don't have, it's not your standard like create incident JSON call that you might be used to from like other products or, but like create record. So they just have save business object, creates records, and it saves records. I'll talk about a little more in depth in that in a different slide. So let's take a look at how we are kind of using these calls in our framework. So here I've got my framework up. Let's just go back here. So I've got, all right, so I've got these object configurations. So when we configure mobile or Kanban for a customer, we have to configure the objects that we're going to work with because Cherwell has all this metadata about these objects, including the object's rec ID, what all the fields are, if it's a date or a date time. So in order for our framework to work, we have to get all that information about the object. So let's just start with an easy one. If I do add business object, this is kind of the first part. So I can look up business objects by major, by supporting, by minor, right? So by group. So this is like a get business object. So this gives me the name of the business object basically. And then what I can do is I can add them. So if I take incident, it says add another incident to the app, sure, I'll do that. So now I've got this object defined. So in the background, I'm saving its rec ID essentially, and some other information about it. So then going back to this, so now I've got the business object summary. I've got the rec ID, and now I'm going to do the business, show you the business object template call. So if I go into like detail fields, so these are the fields that I want to put on either in the grid or on the form. So now we're going out and getting the template, and it's giving us all the fields in the object, right? So we just get a big JSON body back with all the fields, and we get the fields rec ID, the name, there's a bunch of other information about if it's a date, time, what what type it is. There's a ton of information. So now we have access to this information. And then the last piece is the save business object. So where we use that is like on any of our actions. Here, I'm just going to delete this one and go show you an incident. Any of our actions that we have, say like take ownership. That's a OneStep, not a good example. Let's say create incident. So create incident. Now I can take these fields that I've returned. I can take all these fields that I've got, and then I can give them values. And like in our framework, we say, hey, what is that? Is a text box, a checkbox, a comment? So our framework, we're kind of setting up how we're going to display this information to the user, and then we're taking this information, compiling it, all the information we get from here, and we put it into the form, and then we do the save business object. So like if you create an incident, duplicate this here. So if I go into mobile, for example, and I do, here it is, create incident. So now I've got these fields on this form. So I know a lot about these fields from these API calls. I know their rec ID, I know their type. Like this is tied to a drop down. So I can start typing in here and get this nice grid, and I can populate this. And then I know, hey, this is going into, so customer, create incident, customer display name, which is the name of the field in Cherwell, is being populated by this value. So I'm populating customer display name in Cherwell, and there's also other fields then that will get auto-popped in Cherwell, like the customer rec ID, which it also stores. But generally with an API call, those are being done kind of by the object's metadata engine, where you're passing a kind of the primary value and it's getting the other values. And that's kind of out of the box behavior for a lot of things in Cherwell. If it didn't get the value, what we would do then, we would pass in the rec ID. Like when we pull that out of our list picker, let me see if I've got that in here. We can pull other values out. So I can say, hey, out of that list picker populated with full name or phone or SAM account name, I could also throw rec ID in there. And then I could have another field. I could say, hey, customer rec ID, customer ID, I could populate with rec ID from the full name, because that gets pulled back out of that list of customers, right? So yeah, so we're taking all this information, and then in this case, I'm essentially just doing a REST call. So you can see here with this action, all these fields, we just bundle these up into a JSON body and send these over. So that's how we're using that. So that's kind of like we're building a framework with their framework. If you're going to build your own, this is a lot of work to do this, but the benefits are it makes it super flexible to build applications, but it might be more work than you want to take on. So you could just do those calls and kind of, a lot of people are like, oh, I just have this one form I want people to fill out. So you probably wouldn't build like a framework like this, but you would probably have but you'd use all the same information. You'd need the rec IDs of the fields and to know what type they are. So you would use those calls to build that. Okay, so token management. One of the questions, and you'll find out really early on, so you need a REST API key in Cherwell, and that's generating the orange client. And generally, I recommend generating a REST API key for every integration or every app that's going to be hitting the API. And to use this key, and the reason for that is just the simplest thing is if something happens with that API key, somebody's running ad hoc queries that are taking all the database time, you can turn that key off without affecting your other integrations. So best practice is to generate a key for every API integration. So you use this key along with credentials and you retrieve a token basically. So this token is used then in the API calls instead of credentials. So it's safer. So somebody might get this token, but the token expires in 20 minutes, where somebody gets your username and password, you might not know that. So they could use that for weeks, maybe, but these tokens are only good for 20 minutes. And then there's also a refresh token that you can use to re-authenticate and get a new token. So when your token expires, you don't need to re-authenticate with your username and password. You use this refresh token that you got back with the token. And the token does have an expiration date on it, so you can check that. Or you will get an error message back, so you could trap that error message, whatever you whatever you want to do. Then you can use the refresh token. And the concept behind a refresh token is that you can re-authenticate with this refresh token without using credentials. So it's kind of a best practice safety thing to use this refresh token. Now, in a corporate environment, probably not necessary, right? Because you probably don't have someone with a packet sniffer sniffing for usernames and passwords on your corporate network. So if you have something out on the internet like we do, you would want to use refresh tokens in case anything was compromised. This refresh token, it's only good for a day, and then they'd have to re-authenticate with credentials. And there's just some weird things with this refresh token. But so the tokens are delivered, they are specific to the API key and the user ID. So Cherwell keeps track internally of what your token is, who requested it, and what key they used. So one of the problems customers run into is if they've got the same user account, say in a multi-threaded application, or just two applications that are using the same service account, if one application logs in and gets a token and a refresh token, they can use that until that either that same application in a different thread or a different application logs in with the same account and with the same API key. That token, that first token the first user got, will be invalidated, and the refresh token is invalidated. And so now now if somebody else logs in, same account, same API key, now the token that you've got or user A has is bad, and the refresh token is bad, and you'll get an error. So you need to do good token management. With that, I thought I had, oh yeah, I do. Okay, so I have another slide, good. So, and there's also a limit to the number of tokens you can request per minute. So when I first started developing against Cherwell API, I didn't really understand how the tokens worked, and I just got a new token for every call, which is fine. It's a hair slower, but you can still do like 5 transactions a second or something. It's still pretty fast. But so certain versions of Cherwell only allow you to request so many tokens per minute. It's kind of like a packet storm protection. So I learned very quickly that wasn't going to work on every version, and to switch to this kind of token management philosophy. So, and this really gets important if you're using a service account. So like if you've got a portal page, like something on your portal, where Cherwell users aren't logging in and you have to use a service account, this can get really tricky. Or if you've got a multi-threaded integration application that is using multiple threads. So we're actually doing this because we have Portal for mobile. So we have a Portal mobile app. And one of the things with that is there just aren't any API calls for for customers to log in. So you have to use a service account once you authenticate them to pull their records back, to update their records. So you could have 100 users simultaneously on there using the service account. So what we do, we use a semaphore to manage tokens in our mobile portal app. And that's essentially just a global, like a variable that all of our threads use from all our different user sessions. So if one thread discovers that, hey, this token's not valid, I need to use a refresh token, everybody else, there's a hold put on that semaphore, and so that while that thread gets that new token, and so all the other threads wait until that new token is put in, so that we're managing that like with the semaphore. So if you have a multi-threaded application, you either one, need to do token management like that with something like a semaphore or like a database table where you're storing the token, or two, you need 2 different API keys. Or if you don't want to do the token management, you're better off getting a different API, multiple API keys, and then tying those to each thread. You can have as many API keys as you want in Cherwell, and using another API key with the same login does not, at least to my knowledge, does not de-authenticate the first token. So user A gets a token against an API key, and user A again gets another token against a different API key, maybe from a different thread, the first token will still be good. So because it's tied to the login and the API key. So that's something else you can do is multiple APIs. So if you know, hey, I'm running 3 threads, you can create 3 API keys. So it is kind of a lot of work sometimes to manage. If whatever tool you're using, you don't even have the capability of doing token management, you may want to go that route. All right, so some authentication challenges. So authentication via the API, it's pretty straightforward. You can authenticate with Cherwell credentials, with network credentials. You do have to know whether or not to prepend the network credentials with the domain. That kind of depends on how it's set up with Cherwell. Generally, the rule of thumb is you log in the same way as you do in Cherwell. So if you don't have to put your domain in Cherwell, you probably don't have to do it with an API call. SAML is where we start to run into issues. So first thing is SAML for REST is not set up on Cherwell's IIS out of box for anyone, unless you're on version 10. And even if you're on version 10, it might not be set up right, as I found out last week. So what you got to do, and what I'll do for like our mobile and Kanban clients, is right away when we start working with the customer, I'll contact Cherwell support. I get on the partner support or whatever, and I open an API call, and I open a ticket, and I just say, customer ABC needs REST API login set up, or SAML API set up for REST. And then it always goes to the same guy in support, and he always does it, Josh. And it's super simple. So I've got documentation on how to do it. I can send if anybody has questions, but there's essentially in your web config under your Cherwell API, they have a section, put your server name here. You need to put your server name in there. They don't set that up, and without that, REST API will not work. So that's the first thing you have to do. Generally, that's not turned on. 100% of the time, that's not turned on unless somebody's already doing SAML against REST. So Cherwell REST uses different reply URL. So your SAML provider has to be set up with that reply URL. So when you set up Cherwell for SAML logins, your SAML provider, you set that up with a point. I didn't put it in here, but it's pointing to the Cherwell service IIS application, Cherwell service /SAML/assertion.aspx. When you need to authenticate against REST, and now this is how Cherwell is doing it in version 10. So you'll see this change in version 10. So you'll need to do this for version 10. That's what I tell our customers. You'll need to do this for version 10 anyway, so we might as well figure this out for like mobile or Kanban if you want to use SAML. They need to put the reply URL into Cherwell API /SAML/assertion.cshtml. So it's a different API endpoint. It has nothing to do with the calling program. So if we're setting up mobile for a customer, the reply URL is not to our mobile URL or our Kanban URL. It is to Cherwell's API URL. So that's got to be set up in your SAML provider. Extremely easy on Active Directory. You can use wildcards even. Now Okta, we set up a customer in Okta. They were using the community edition of the Cherwell connector, which did not have a spot for another reply URL. So they had to create a brand new Okta connector so that they could put 2 reply URLs in there. Safari on iPhones and iPads and even Macs have numerous challenges with Cherwell's REST API and SAML. So this is a Cherwell problem, and it's how they configured their API. And honestly, the problem is just so dang old. It doesn't work with these newer Apple devices. So they do have some workarounds for that. Sometimes you have to play around with that. And shoot, I was going to put the parameters in here. I'll put this out. I'll put the parameters in here before this gets posted. But there's 2 parameters in there, IDP something, and I don't know. They're true and false, and you just got to play with them till it works on iPhone. So you'll see on iPhones they'll authenticate great against like a Cherwell login or network login, but when you try to go the SAML, there's just some weird things that happen with Safari and Chrome, unfortunately, on iPhones, because Chrome is just a wrapper around Safari. I don't know if everyone knows that, but Apple does not let you write your own web browsers for iOS. You have to use Safari and then put your own little wrapper around it, which Chrome has done. And so that's kind of a challenge for authentication. That's something you'll run into, like if you say, hey, I want a mobile page so people can submit, I don't know, password reset or something. If you want them to log in with SAML on an iPhone, you're going to need to get those parameters right on either your IIS server, which is fairly easy, or you get on the phone with Cherwell support. And like Josh over there is kind of the API guy. He knows where those are and what to do. So that's usually how I work with on that. But it doesn't matter what app you have. It's a problem with Cherwell's configuration frankly, it's just really old code and need to update. All right, so if you have some sort of a portal application, and I believe someone did something at Clear last year, a portal they developed, and I talked to the gentleman, I can't remember his name, sorry, Kevin something, shoot. Anyway, so if you're developing a portal app, there's really no authentication methods for portal logins in the REST API. So if you want to authenticate, like for our portal app, we use, there is a SOAP, like an XML authentication method you could use to authenticate them against SAML or the network, so that works. If you're on premise, you can probably just use a different authentication piece, because all you really need to do is identify who the user is, because they can't interact with Cherwell anyway. So you just need to figure out who they are somehow. So for us, it's authenticating against SAML or just Cherwell's API call. So, but there is no portal API call in REST. So this is the old SOAP. So then now you have to use a service account. So the service account has to do all the things like, hey, pull back my open tickets. Hey, I want to add a journal entry to this or a note. The service account does all of that work behind the scenes. So some things I've run into is like the service account, they will be the last user in the last mod user field. I've even put in currently logged in users ID in there, and it just gets overwritten by the API by the API call. So you really have to have a solid token management strategy here to ensure that you don't hit the rate limit on token requests. So this is where you really need to have a solid token management strategy, where like we're using a semaphore to manage it, and if the token runs out, all the threads get held up until a new token, it generally takes 200 milliseconds to get a new token, so it's not a big deal. But if you end up with a couple of hundred customers on this thing, and you're just getting a new token for every request, you can find out quickly that you'll hit that rate limit and you'll start getting errors. And then you got to be careful not to violate Cherwell's licensing rules here. So portal users can only update the records they own. And like we work with some government organizations, and so we've had to go deep dive into, okay, what can we do with portal apps, and had to work with Cherwell to say because some of these organizations just, they can't, you might be out there and say, well, I'm just going to, what Cherwell going to do? But some of these government organizations, they can't have something like, Cherwell can't come in and audit them. And if they have a problem, they got a big problem, right? So they really have to follow the licensing guidelines. So if you're writing a portal app, you do have to make sure you should make sure that you're, following their guidelines, where portal users can only update records they own. And the big issue is the portal users, you're essentially using one license when you're using a service account. So it will take up one license, but if you've got your techs out there using like this portal app to transfer tickets and things like that, and that's technically against Cherwell licensing policy. So just be careful there. Are running OneStep. So running OneSteps with the REST API isn't available until 9.7. So if you're on a pre-9.7 version and you want to run OneSteps in an app, you've got to run them with the SOAP API. So this requires an additional authentication step, as the SOAP API and REST APIs do not cross-share auth tokens. SOAP uses a cookie. A REST API uses a token. They're just different authentication methods, or not authentication methods, but once you've authenticated, you can't use the token that you get back for REST API because SAML needs a cookie, or the SOAP needs a cookie. So if you use SAML, you'll have to use to run a OneStep, you'll have to use the Cherwell mobile SOAP login. It's the only one that supports the SAML login. So there's a couple different SOAP logins. There's a Cherwell login and then a Cherwell mobile login. Then there's a little checkbox in Cherwell you have to make sure you have checked. So it's the only one that supports the SAML parameter. And then to actually run the OneSteps, you have to craft the encryption method that Cherwell uses to encrypt and decrypt the redirect URI. So we did, but I would say it's not for the faint of heart. So if you want to run OneSteps in your app and you're on SAML, your best bet's to go to 9.7. So some things about running OneSteps, they can't be in the blueprint folder. They will not be found by the API call. So kind of the same thing with the blue client, you can, although with the blue client, you can run OneSteps in the folder by actions, right? You just can't go find them. So if you've got all your OneSteps in your blueprint folder and you want to run them from an API call, you have to either create copies of them and stick them somewhere else where they can be found, or just move them into the public domain. Certain UI items in the OneStep may cause a OneStep to fail. It's kind of, this is all over the board. You're really going to have to test to see if the OneSteps work. I always test them in SOAP UI to see if I get a good message back. But like a pop-up message that requires an OK, that might hang it. And now that's different from prompts. Actually, so Cherwell handles the prompt piece, and I'll kind of show you what that looks like. But so if you're using branch logic and prompts, you must build a prompt builder on your app API side. So if you got a big OneStep that uses different prompts to take you down different branches, you have to ask those questions up front. You can't ask the questions in the middle of the OneStep, because that's not how running OneSteps from the API works. You just call the OneStep, pass it the prompt parameters, and you're done. You don't get to like ask another question in the middle of the OneStep like you do in the blue client. So I'm just going to show you quick what it looks like in our framework to pull back a OneStep and populate those fields. So I'm just going to go in here and create a new action. We've got a bunch of out-of-the-box actions. I'm just going to take one and modify it, assign it to user. So we've got kind of, when we build our actions, we've got this action builder, and we can do certain things like we can add a new incident, edit the selected object. We can run a OneStep, upload a file. Then we got these add related, like we can add related objects as an action. So I'm just going to choose run a OneStep here and click this, and then okay. So I'm going to put in the OneStep name. So this is a little different in 9.7. 9.7 actually have access to the list of OneSteps, and pre 9.7 you do not. So you have to know the name of it. So I'm just going to look up resolve incident, and you have to know the scope. This is just global. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is retrieve the prompt. So this is the first thing that you would do when you want to run a OneStep. You'd retrieve the prompts. I have a little thing that tells me, okay, there's 2 prompts. So now I'm going to go look at these prompts. When you run this in like SOAP UI or something, you'd see these prompts returned. There's a couple bugs with this. So like these are basically this returned 2 prompts, right? So it returned, please select the cause code and please enter the closed description here. So this is literally the text that you typed in when you created this prompt. So there's kind of a bug with lists and the prompt returns. I don't know if it's a bug or how it's supposed to work, but I think it's a bug. So it'll actually return the list of values in that dropdown. And maybe they did that so you could use that value. So maybe you could use those. I stripped those out because we use a different methodology of getting those. But you cannot send in that prompt with that list of values. It will not work. So we stripped those out. So this is literally what we send in when we run the OneStep. Please select the cause code. And then we're just putting a form up basically that says please select the cause code or please select the closed description. So it would look something like if we just resolve an incident here. So if I do, I gotta follow the process. Begin work. All right, so now I should have resolve incident. So prior to running the OneStep, so now I take these, please select the cause code and please enter the closed description here. So now I've got values that I put in here. This is just populating basically. Then I run this, and then that runs the OneStep and passes in the prompt parameters. So that's what you're seeing here. Is just basically these fields are the prompts that are sent back. We populate those, and then we send them out, and that works pretty well. So you'll notice, like if you run our mobile client, sometimes if you're running a OneStep and you're logged in, it may take a little while to run the OneStep the first time, because if your SOAP API login has expired, which is not related at all to your REST API login, we have to relog you in behind the scenes. So, and that can take 10 seconds, 15 seconds sometimes to do. So that's what that looks like. So that you would do kind of the same thing on your form. Okay, let's get back to this. All right, so saving versus creating records. This comes up a lot, especially with new developers kind of working a lot of times with an integration. A lot of times they're creating records, and that's simple enough. You send in creating records, the fields I have here, I've highlighted, you don't need. So a lot of times, in fact, this cache key and cache scope, you would never send in either. So you're populating the business object ID and then your fields, which are down here, and you populate. You can see dirty's got to be true. That if it's false or not there, it won't update. You got your display name, your field ID. You don't need HTML. So you're putting in your display name, your field ID, and value, which you can't see here. But and a lot of times what I'll see is customers will remove this business object ID and rec ID. They'll remove it out of here because it's pre-populated with string, and it'll throw an error. So they'll remove it out of here, and then they'll come back and they'll want to update the record, and they'll put like the incident ID, say, in fields, and then they'll update the record, and they'll run. Part of the problem is there's no create business object. There's only save business object. So you're using save business object to create. You've got this call. You're like, oh, great. Now I have the incident ID. I'll stick it in fields, and it'll update. Well, that's not how it works, unfortunately. What will happen if you do that and you see two incidents now in your database with the same incident ID, you need to populate one of these two fields. So in the save business object, if these two fields are not populated, you'll get a record creation, no matter what. Even if it's a duplicate incident ID or person, you'll get a record creation. So if you're updating something, you have to have either the rec ID filled out, or more than likely you're going to use the public ID, which is going to be the incident ID, friendly name, whatever the public ID is. So you will get an error back if the public ID has duplicates. So a lot of times customers will say, hey, this update worked once, but then it stopped working. I get an error. And what happened is they created a record. Now they're updating it with the public ID down here in fields, and that creates a duplicate. But now we've got two. So the third time they come in to update it, they get an error. Well, and then maybe they figure out that they need to put this in here. And so then they put public ID in, and now they get an error because now they have two public IDs of that incident in the database. And so when they try to update it, it just comes back as an error. And no, the error does not say, hey, you have two IDs. It just says, hey, 500, have fun finding out what's wrong. It doesn't actually say that, but that's essentially what happens. So that I've seen that happen a lot. It's happened a lot. So they figure out, hey, to update, I need to put this in here, and then they put that in there, and they get an error. Then they get frustrated, and they work 2 days on it because they don't see that they have two incidents with the same ID in the database. So that's a pretty important caveat when saving and creating records. So, and I've run into that a lot. I've even done it myself a couple times. All right, so I'm going to talk about the required specifics conundrum. So if you have a UI for creating records that have specifics, like we do in mobile, we have like portal and tech client, we just merge the specifics into the same form basically, and you can fill out those specifics. Now, if any of those specifics are required, I put it in caps, you will not be able to save the record. You will get an error. Trust me on this. I spent maybe not a week, but maybe like 4 days on this. We tried everything, like creating different specifics field record that didn't have, and like renaming it or updating it with the right type. And honestly, on some versions, some of our tricks worked, but on other versions they did not. So we could not come up with a good trick for this, unfortunately. So a good trick if you're on like 9.3.2 is you can actually create the incident, but tell it to create a different type of specifics without. So we created like a specifics generic, did not have any required fields. And then what happens is when you do an API call to create an incident, it creates the incident and then it creates the specifics at the same time. So if you pass it, so what you have to do on the API side is you have to create the incident, look up the specifics record, and then update it. Well, where you run into a problem is on that create, if the specific has a required field, it will not let you create the incident. You'll get an error, and you'll say, hey, but look, I have the specific field filled out on my form. It's right there, but behind the scenes, the API call is actually updating the specifics. So, but yeah, so if you like trick the system and create a specific type of a different type that doesn't have a required field, that will actually work on some versions, and then you can just change, and it can go back, update it, and change the type. So that actually does work. That's one thing we found that works on older versions, but not newer versions, unfortunately. So, so there's a couple of workarounds for this. So API-specific validations, you can change those. So like I just worked with a customer, everything coming in mobile has a call source of mobile. So they updated their specifics validations to say only be required if the call source is not mobile. So then what, and we require the fields on our mobile UI, so the customer has to put it in. But because of the way it works behind the scenes, it has to go in, not required, and then we update it. And just I've seen tons of questions about this. I've seen like ideation station. I think there's stuff in there that people voted on, but it's just a big problem, right? So we're not really using OneSteps to create records. A lot of times we're just using API calls. So the other option is to use a OneStep that creates the record and the specifics. So you can actually create a OneStep that creates your incident. And of course, in the OneStep, the specifics is tied in there, and then you can populate the specifics there. So there's a bunch of problems with that. So we have a solution. It's kind of kludgy. I'd rather not do it, but we have a solution. So we have a OneStep, takes a JSON body as a parameter, and then we parse through the JSON body and populate the field with that, right? So it works pretty well. There's some weird things like it's not a true JSON body because, of course, Cherwell's API uses a colon as a delimiter. So, and of course, what's in JSON bodies? Nothing but colons. So we had to replace all our colons with a special character. So then we pass it in as a prompt, and then I parse through the prompt. I replace all the special characters with colons. So now we have a good JSON body, and then you can pretty simply parse through the JSON body and populate the fields in the incident and the specific. So, so that if you do have specifics that have required fields, you don't want to do the mobile version of taking away the specific requirements. You can do it this way, but it's kind of a pain, and you have to manually go into the OneStep and assign every JSON field to. When I first wrote it, I was pinging my consultants, how do I loop through this JSON and just put like the field name, hey, assign it to the field name with the same JSON tag basically in there. Oh, you can't, you have to do it manually. Oh, okay. So you have to do it manually. I mean, it doesn't take that long. It takes 2 minutes to do, but you got to do it for everyone. So you only have one step. So maybe you have 100 specifics fields that are required. You got to do it for 100 fields. So and it's a problem either way. It's just an API thing. Hopefully Cherwell will fix it. But unfortunately with Cherwell, hey, we don't backport fixes to any other versions. It's going to be at least somewhere out in the future, so you won't be able to use it. So, but here's the solutions. I've seen 100 people ask about this. This is what you can do. All right, let's talk a little bit about saved searches. So saved searches is a really easy way to turn the records you use in Cherwell that your users are interested in. So you can use these saved searches. They're already in your Cherwell system. Your Cherwell admin has written these for your users. And let me just show you how this kind of works. So if I go back into our framework, I can go into my object and I can say, hey, what are the searches I want to run? I can go here and click add remove searches. Now we're just doing an API call, give me all the searches associated with this object. Here they all are. You can run any of these searches, so you can call any of these searches. So essentially, when I go here, I can run these searches. So I'm just in mobile, we just tag them basically and say, here are the searches that are available in mobile out of that list. So then I can go, yeah, I can run my open incidents and service requests, all open incidents, any search that's in Cherwell I can run. So really easy, you don't have to build the search with an ad hoc query. Unfortunately, we're not a perfect world. So obviously, something this easy, there has to be problems with, right? Yes, there's tons of problems. So they're fraught with problems. So sometimes users will get 500 errors running a search. Why? Who knows? I've worked with support for 3 months on this. We found one resolution, there's a system function, get the logged in user ID. That will sometimes fix it. But what do you do for all open incidents? I can't run all open incidents. So the only fix, literally the only fix for it, you have to delete that user's account and recreate them, and that'll work 100% of the time. That'll work. Why is it broken? I don't know. So I'll talk about ad hoc searches in a little bit. So, but for customers who have this issue, we put in ad hoc searches, which you can't do all the stuff you can do with save searches, but there's some benefits to those we'll talk about in a little bit. So that's one big one, and trust me, if you use these save, you'll find it. I mean, it's just crazy, and Cherwell's no idea why it's happening. Save searches are also prone to caching issues. So my open incidents, if you run that, so for some customers, the next person that runs it gets, like if Bob runs it, and then Joe runs it, Joe gets Bob's incidents in results it. And you can reproduce it in Swagger by logging in as both of those users. We see it happen. So we've kind of replaced my open and my team's open with ad hoc, because for some customers it caches, for some it doesn't. I use this all the time, it doesn't cache. Well, good for you. It does cache for some customers. It's awful. And it's just random, like randomly starts caching, and I've done a ton of work on this, and actually what Cherwell is doing is they're saving those results in some of these backend tables in SQL, and they're using those results as a caching mechanism, and it's just built into how their API works. Save searches that use parameters also prone to caching issues. So you could send in a save search that says, hey, give me all the tickets where status equals open, and then 2 seconds later run, give me all the tickets where status equals pending, and you'll get all the open tickets back. So that's pretty awful. We ended up just not using that. That was pretty consistent across versions, that caching issue with searches or parameters. And also the big one that everyone runs into, save searches, use the field in the default grid as the result set. So if there is a field you want and it's not in the default grid, you got to re-retrieve the record to get it. Or populate your default grid with the fields you want. And it actually works if you go on the Blue client and populate your own grid, and then you run it as you. But if somebody else runs it, they won't see the field. So you'll see it like every time Cherwell asks about the BI or talks about the BI connector that comes up. I don't see the fields. They have to put them in your default grid. Well, every field, yes, every field. Will we use it in the portal? Well, that's just how it works, right? So it's not great. They don't give you the option of using a custom grid or just retrieving all the fields. It's kind of limited. So yeah, save searches, it's awesome. And like when you look at this, like it's so easy to set up. I don't have to write any of these. I just go in here and say, hey, customer, what search do you want? Oh, all new incidents. There you go. I'll give you all new incidents. Oh, I click save here. I go into here, I refresh my screen, and I get all new incidents. I mean, it's that fast to add a query using save query. So when they work, they are awesome because you can get the results back really quick. But if they don't work, they're horrible. Okay, so let's talk about ad hoc queries. So we've kind of moved to this ad hoc query concept where we're replacing some of these save queries that have the caching issues or 500 issues. And most common, like I'll be honest, most common is incident with the 500 errors and caching issues. Change, problem, task, those all work great. Don't ask me what's up. I don't know. Believe me, I've spent hundreds of hours trying to fix this problem. So because the save searches have so many issues, you may want to consider building ad hoc queries. They're not prone to the caching issues of save searches. They return the fields you specifically asked for and do not return only the default grids fields, which is awesome. Some downsides, there's kind of a limited where clause builder, like there's no not equals. So you got to use the equals. And they kind of follow the rules that all fields that are different use an and all multiple fields with the same name are an or. So you don't have an operator in this call, in this ad hoc query call. There is no operator that says and or. It's just implied. If the field names are different, it's an and the field names are the same, it's an or. So it works pretty well. So like we have a little ad hoc query builder that we built. So if I go into grid searches, I can add a new search and I can say, hey, add a new custom ad hoc. And I can go in here And then we kind of have this, so we can say like, all right, status, since there's no not equals, we do a not equals. I can do add rule status equals new, and then I can do status equals in progress. All right, so this is an applied or. So you notice, like we have the grouping clause all. It doesn't matter what our grouping clause is, because when we send this through the API, we just send in, hey, status equals new, status equals in progress. We don't put an and or in there. But there is no capability to do it. So if I had a different field and I want to say owned by, and then we have a little variable we use for logged in user. So now I've got status equals new. And so we just send this over as, hey, this field equals this field equals this field. So if I add like a subgroup here, like we have this subgroup, but Cherwell doesn't really have this concept of a subgroup. So it doesn't really matter how I throw this together. So it works pretty well. I mean, and it's fast, and there's a lot of things I like about it, but you can only go so deep. Like you can't look up related records, right? So if I wanted to see all the incidents where the contact was inactive, I can't do that unless I'm saving that inactive field in the incident. So there's some things where we just can't do in our ad hoc query builder because it's just not possible via the API. So it's pretty nice. It'll probably work for most queries that you have. And the nice thing with it is that you get back all the fields you ask for. You have to ask for them, but like for us, we know, like when we look at our grid, we say, oh, I need incident ID status, owned by team description, call source cost, and pending start time. These are the fields I need back, right? So just give me these fields. So payload smaller, and we get those back. And then when we go into the record, now that's a different call. We're not doing an ad hoc query. We're just getting a record, right? So that gives us all the fields that we need. So, and we merge in the specific, like these are specifics, we merge those in. So that is how that works. So ad hoc is pretty new for us. We finally put that in a few months ago after all these issues with the save queries. So. All right, relating records. So there's some pretty nifty ways to relate records via the API. I'm just going to show you what it looks like from an API perspective. If I go in here, I've got my relationships here, and I can add a related object. And so it gives me all the relationships. So there's an API call that's sending this information back. So I can say, hey, give me all the related objects, like incident links change request. I can do that. And then in our UI, we say, is it a separate button, or is it a field, or is it what kind of link location is it? So, but you can do that. And then when you create, so when we actually create related records, what I'll do, if this is change request, I'll actually go in here. Yes, I'll actually go in here to, well, let's put that in actually. So I'm going to do the incident links change request. Save this.
Eric, just so you know, creeping up in the top of the hour, and there are a couple questions.
Okay, sounds good. So I've got incident links change request. So now I've created this relationship. Now if I go over to changes, like I've got, oh shoot, I don't have create change. Anyway, from incident, what we can do then is we can create an action where we're creating another record. So like, do this. So from here, then we can say, hey, add related, and then we've got all these relationships. So we can add related similar incidents, major SL. So we can add any of these, like we're the owner, we can add related records basically. So that's pretty cool. So there is a little caveat with this. The relationships relating things works pretty well. However, creating related records doesn't always work. So like you might create a related journal entry with an API call and like, hey, why isn't this related? I have no idea. It's just broken in some versions. So what we've standardized on is creating the related record and then using the relationship to relate them together. So there is like a relate records call. That's what we do. It's in the background. You may or may not have to do that. We have to do it because we're developing across all these different releases that have all these different problems, but that works 100% of the time. So you got to be careful on how the relationships are set up in Cherwell versus how they work in the API. So this is like the most common issue, right? You want to add a note via an API call, and you want to relate it to an incident. Well, if you do that in, like in the Orange client, in a blueprint, you can say, hey, here's a button, add a note, and it'll say add journal, and then do you want to add a special type of journal, like a sub-object, like a note, and then you pick out of the drop-down what you want to add. The API doesn't work like that. If you use the journal relationship to add a note, you will get a journal. And out of the box, there is no note relationship. So if you want to add a note via an API call, you have to add that relationship. You have to add it like an incident owns notes. You have to add that relationship. There's no way to do it. Well, in some versions, you can actually put in the business object ID and it'll work, but in most versions it doesn't. So best practice is to add the relationship and then use that relationship to create the note. Otherwise, you'll probably just have problems. All right, hold on, Steve. Let me check and see how many slides I have left. I want to see. Oh, you know, I only have a couple slides left. Let me do these slides and then I'll do questions in case people want to go. Public ID versus rec ID. In a lot of the API calls, you can choose to use either. So now it gets tricky when you start running into objects that have duplicate values in the public ID, but rely on that field for relationships. So configuration item, worst offender. So lots of things like public ID, they use that to relate to incident. And if you end up with a friendly name that's duplicated, you get an error. So we have like built into our framework the option, like, so generally we use public ID. So we have a little checkbox to say, hey, retrieve by public ID. So it's unique. But if we don't have unique and we're getting errors, we can uncheck this and it'll use rec ID. Now the problem is if you're using rec ID to retrieve the incident, some things won't work using rec ID that use public ID, like relating a CI to an incident. If it uses public ID, the rec ID piece that we have in here won't work. And it's just a problem with Cherwell, how it's set up, and how the API uses that information. So, all right, getting team membership, big hole in Cherwell's API, doesn't exist, right? You can say, hey, who are Eric's teams? And it'll give you Eric my teams. But if you say, give me all the members of the service desk team, Cherwell, well, you can't do it. So it's a big hole. Yes, it's a big hole. And a lot of customers are using, so there's a couple workarounds for this. A lot of customers are already using the view team members workaround because if you want to like assign from a specific team in a OneStep, you literally can't do it in Cherwell. You have to use this workaround for it. So it involves creating a view in SQL Server. If anybody wants that view, I can send it over. Support does it all the time. Cherwell PS does it. All the partners do it. And then create a Cherwell metadata object, which they just call an object. I always like to call it their metadata objects. That's really all it is. It's just XML metadata over a SQL table. But you create an object over it so you can interact with it via the API. So you don't probably want to update it via this. You don't want to create an updatable view because this pulls from some of the trebuchet tables, so you don't really want to update those with this view. But it'll give you a list of team members when you use query by team. So pretty slick, it works. We use it for some of our customers that have it. The other option is to build a cache table of all the teams and their members using the get user teams API call. Of course, it's not real time. You could do it real time, but it's kind of time consuming. So like for our mobile and Kanban, we actually cache it up on Azure. And so when customers ping it, it's there in cache. But you don't need to modify your Cherwell system to make it work. And that's one of the things with our products. One of our guiding principles is that we don't need to modify Cherwell to make these work. So if you want to view, and some people might say, well, if you want to view team membership, you have to put this view team members in. No, we don't do that. So that's the only reason. So a lot of customers that we work with end up putting this in because it is real time where the caching is not, because we're not constantly caching it, because it is, if a customer has 200 users, we have to pull in every single user, get every team that they're in, and then build a big cache of all the team membership using that user information. So this view team members is much more real time. All right, I just want to do a quick short performance demo. I was going to talk about performance, but generally performance is pretty good. Like if I go to the home screen and go to incidents and all new incidents, I mean, imagine doing that in the blue client, how long that would take. So when you write an API application, even like just bringing up a ticket, like it's really fast, right? And if I go to, like if I go to home here and go to our Kanban boards, like when I approve, and like here, I'm going to approve something, right? So I'm going to approve it. I drop it on here, boom, it's approved. I mean, let's go in and watch like how fast this is. All right, so we can go in and watch here. So we can see it took 354 milliseconds to approve that record. So that's round trip. That's it saying, hey, Cherwell, here is, I'm on Azure, and this Cherwell instance is actually behind a firewall. And so it's going from Azure to our firewall to our Cherwell server, updating the information back, and then getting, and then also retrieving the information back in case anything changed in Cherwell, and doing that. It took 354 milliseconds. So that's really fast, like a third of a second. So stuff that we do in the API, you will just notice that it's a lot faster to work with API calls than to work with Cherwell's blue client or web client. So I don't know if Cherwell's going to go this route. I've recommended to them many times, hey, rewrite your client completely API based, because then if you want to do a UI overhaul, it won't take 6 years like it did for this last one. It would take more like 2 months or 3 months, because you're not so tied into your development environment, into your UI. So we'll see if they go that route. It'd be a big change, but like we created essentially a UI. We can do 90% of the stuff you can do in Cherwell, and it's 10 times faster and not prone to error and easy to use. So hopefully Cherwell goes that route with their UI, but it probably take them a while to get there. So, really good performance. You can expect that. If you run into something, you can do some tuning on it, but generally, even the queries, these ad hoc queries come back really fast. Even when we use a not equals, which we're basically pulling back all the records that match and then dumping out the ones that don't, that even runs really fast. So I would say that stuff runs really fast. All right, so what do we got for questions, Steve? Look at that, 11:08. I kind of went over, but
but a lot of people have stayed on. So there's, and some of these questions, go back, 15, 20 minutes ago. But
okay,
can Cherwell automatically create an API token for a developer? For example, if it's a large organization with many developers and a developer submits a ticket that has been approved.
No.
No.
Not that I know of. No, there's no. You'd need an API call or like a OneStep process, and I don't think there's a OneStep system function to create an API token.
Okay. Another one. Any tips on bringing information from a different system, let's say from Workday to Cherwell, customer or internal, where we don't have the rec ID or can use the public ID because there might be people with the same name?
So best practice for that, especially for customers, is to bring in the primary key of like Workday or whatever you're bringing it in from. So if you bring that primary key in, a lot of times it'll be like an employee number for customer. A lot of times, and that's usually where we're running into issues is like customer or maybe CIs. So then we're using from the calling program, say we're using Extra Hop or don't come in from Extra Hop or something like that. They will have a key on their side. So you want to make sure you pass that in, because when you update Cherwell from another system, you want to make sure you're updating the record that you want to update. And truly the only way to really know for sure is to update the record that has the same key that you're passing in. So what you've got to do, now of course you can't send that in for the update because it's not the public ID or the rec ID. But what you have to do is pull it, query it by that key. So let's say we're using Workday and we've got an employee ID. So you query it back with employee ID, and then you get the public ID, or even better, the rec ID from that, and then you update with the rec ID the information that you want to update. But the key is to store that key from the calling program.
Okay, and then let's see, Kevin had, what about using a save, and I don't really know what this is pertaining to, it was a few minutes ago. What about using a save action on incident that fills in dummy info on the specific screen to meet the requirements?
It still doesn't work, because what happens is the incident is created before, like physically is created before the specifics is created. So, well, I shouldn't say that. It's created blank. When you create an incident with an API call, it's created blank. And so there is no API call to pass in specific information to an incident. What you have to do is pass it into the specific. Well, the problem is there is no like create incident with specifics calls. So you create an incident, it creates the specifics behind the scenes, and then you look it up and update it. So there is no way to pass data to a specifics that's getting created. One thing we did try is we created the specific first, and then tried to relate it to an incident or something like that, but that still didn't work, because you're still stuck with, when you create that incident, it creates an empty specifics record. It's just a broken part of how the API works. And there's nothing you can do about it. So you can't put any workflow or anything in there. It just creates it empty. So go out on Ideation Station and upvote to create specifics with incident idea that's out there, because that is the fix, and it's just not there yet.
And then when you were showing the searching cache issues, what version was that? Is the question.
Yeah, I don't remember specifically the version that for sure it was broken in 9.3.2, 100% broken in 9.3.2. It may also be broken in 9.6.3. We did, as soon as we found one version it was broken in, we just stopped using it, because we have to support all these different versions. So, but 100% broken in 9.3.2. I know that for sure, because that's like our kind of our core development platform is 9.3.2, where we kind of start testing stuff at. So, and if it's broken there, we just kind of, we can't use it in any other version. So 9.3.2 broken for sure.
All right, yeah, and that's it, Eric.
Okay.
And remember, everybody that's still on, this is being recorded and it will be sent out to the Cherwell community. So you know, you'll get another email from us with a link to this recording.
Yeah, and I think it'll probably go on our website too eventually, and then Laura or Steve will probably do like a LinkedIn post for it. So if you have other people that you might think are interested, either when we put it on LinkedIn, you can share it there, or once it gets on our website, I think Laura and Steve are working on a mail with all the links to all of our practitioner calls on our website that's going to go out shortly. So this will be in there also. So if you want to forward it on to somebody, I know a lot of times we get like the Cherwell developers on these calls who aren't necessarily doing the API development. They've got another group that does that. So if you've got API developers that you think might be interested in this, you know, once you get the link, you can forward that to, or I think we're getting an email out to them with all the links, or I think this will probably show up on LinkedIn in a couple of days too. So.
Yep, probably be a variety of ways to view it.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Eric. Thanks, everyone, and hope you have a good rest of the week and a good upcoming weekend. And we look forward to you joining our next webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.